I think another big feature of this little section here for Voss answers the question also of so what after sin, what happens? And it seems that within this, if it's ex pacto or not, but within this presentation in which Israel's relationship to Jehovah is suspended entirely upon a position of inexorable justice, what happens when they violate? And Voss's point and the prophet's point is that there is a rupture in the bond, that something changes, something drastic, something tragic, but it doesn't rupture the relationship entirely. Now, that's what would happen if we had a perfectly legal framework and it was dependent on inexorable justice according to perfect personal, exact, and entire obedience. If there's a violation, it's over, it's done with. The Lord has nothing to do with his people anymore. They're not his people. Lo ami. Now, there are aspects of that in which he does exile the nation, but what does he do? It's always with a greater intent, a greater goal, and a greater purpose. There's always a typological dimension to the nation. And God's dealings with the nation are not meant to be a pure recapitulation or just a hitting of the reset button with Adam now at a corporate level. There are lessons to be learned. There are repetitions. There are echoes of that relationship. But they all, for me, they shouldn't necessarily be understood as some sort of subservient covenant, but as a typological national corporate dimension that further sets the stage for what Christ does as true Israel, as the
Yes.
final and eschatological Son of God who succeeds where the typological Adam, or I mean where the protological Adam and the typological Israel failed. And so, again, let me read just a real brief section here just to tie in what Voss is actually saying with what I mean.
Good.
Here at the beginning of this section on 263, the early prophets predict clearly that the bond of the bereaved will be suspended. It will not, to be sure, be irreparably broken off. Now, of course, we have a later restoration to come. There's no reason for that in the critic's view. But here, now on page 264 at the first indentation, the judgment comes on account of the sin of the people. Itself it belongs, as we shall see, to the eschatological perspective. But the sins leading up to it belong to the present stage. The prophets nowhere deal with sin in the abstract. It is always the concrete sin of Israel with which they are concerned. This, however, they most strictly relate to Jehovah. Strictly speaking, there is no sin except against God. So we'll get into in a second here the corporate sins of Israel and how Amos and others considered that. But I think there's a lot to be said there in terms of Voss's presuppositions and the biblical presuppositions, that any sin that occurs for the nation is a sin against God, but it also presupposes that relationship between God and Israel and the undergirding covenantal relationship that has been established, namely through Abraham. And even when they sin, even when they are exiled, the Lord is still faithful to his promises. And all of the national dealings with Israel need to be understood in the context of Abraham, not as just some other thing, some
Yes.
appendix, but they
Yes.
actively serve and move forward this relationship, which is distinguishing it from, a classic dispensationalist view, which would say that Israel was better off under Abraham than under Moses, and they should have rejected the Mosaic Covenant to begin with.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. In fact, we won't read it, but Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14, is a prophecy that brings into view the return of Israel from exile and the Lord gathering his people by way of resurrection from the dust of death. Now, when you read that text in light of the person and work of Christ, and you realize that he himself is the narrowed down remnant, if you're asking the question of the offspring of Abraham, who remains faithful to the Lord, it is one. And so when, for instance, in Luke 4, a text that we've talked about in various contexts, when Jesus is presented after he is baptized and endowed with the Spirit and the Spirit of new creation and the Spirit of life and righteousness rests upon him, and the Father says, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased," you get a narrative, genealogy, that takes you from Jesus' contemporary experience back to David, showing he's David's greater son, David's Lord, back to Abraham, showing he is the offspring of Abraham, as Paul is going to say in Galatians 3:16 and 29. And then you go back to Adam as son of God, so that when you think about Jesus Christ in light of these promises that were made to Abraham and penultimately fulfilled under Moses, and then this breach of the covenant relation occurs under the prophets, what you find from the standpoint of a text like Ezekiel 37 and related texts is that Jesus Christ is not only the second and last Adam, but the new and true Israel. Adam was the son of God in the holy realm of Eden. Israel was the son of God, Exodus 4:23, in the holy realm of Canaan. Adam sinned and fell and was exiled. And on the heels of that, what was given? The promise of the Messiah. Israel's sin and fall and exile is the grand covenant historical preparation for the coming of the Messiah, for the true seed of the woman, for the faithful offspring of Abraham, for the one that if you are joined to Jesus, what does Paul say? In Galatians 16, you're the Israel of God, 6:16, if you're a new creature in Christ, 6:15. Philippians 3:3, we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit and put no confidence in the flesh. Romans 2:26 through 29 speaks the same way. So the whole point here, and this is Voss's point, is that the coming of Jesus takes on the fullness of fulfilling these promises that God made to Abraham and that were provisionally fulfilled in Israel. It's not a cutting off altogether, but now a gathering of elect Jew and Gentile, a grafting in of Gentiles into the one olive tree, into the true Israel of God in Jesus Christ. And if you insert that artificial, we'll call it here, this critical justice principle, you've excised the whole swatch of Mosaic and prophetic revelation from the redemptive organism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's would undermine, in Voss's view and in traditional confessional Presbyterian theology, it would undermine the logic of the coming of Jesus, not only as second and last Adam, but as Abraham's offspring in the new and true Israel, in whom the whole house of Israel is gathered, and in Christ, Ephesians 2:1 through 10, raised from death to walk in newness of life.